All right, so the Revival Health platform, there's basically three underlying pillars upon which this platform is built. And in this video, we're going to talk through the first one, which is sort of the overall guiding rationale or organizing framework for the platform. And it's basically this idea or this concept that we were healthy, we made a bunch of changes, we got sick. And if we want to revive ourselves, then what we need to do is undo these changes, right? So the way I like to introduce this is with a story. So I'm gonna tell you guys a tall tale. Now this is a tall tale about a guy named Bob. So there's Bob. Bob has been fit, he's been strong, he's been healthy his entire life. And then one day he just suddenly gets hit with a bunch of stuff. He's sick and he's tired, he's got these chronic diseases, he's suffering from pain. I mean, basically just feels like crap. So obviously, what does Bob do? He goes and sees the town doctor. Now, one of the first questions she asked Bob is, well, have you made any changes, to your life, to your lifestyle? And Bob thinks for a sec, and he says, well, yeah, actually, changed a lot of stuff. I found this box full of food near my house, and I've been eating that ever since. I don't know what it is, but it sure tastes good. Well, this is not a very difficult diagnostic for the doctor. She basically says, duh, Bob, stop eating that stuff. And by the way, I'm going to tell everyone else in town that they should avoid it as well, because this is clearly some sort of, cleverly disguised poison. And then Bob's obviously happy. Thanks, doc. That was easy. But this is a tall tale, right? So we need to wipe the slate clean, and I'm going to give you guys an alternative ending to that story. Now let's imagine that the doctor, she pauses, she thinks for a sec, and then she goes, here's an idea, Bob. Keep eating that stuff. I'm going to do everything I can to keep you alive for as long as possible. You're going to remain sick and debilitated, and you'll still eventually die, from whatever this stuff is, but that's my idea. What do you think about that, Bob? Well, Bob doesn't need to think much. I think he thinks he needs to get a new doctor. Now, this is the punchline. You know what? So guess what? You're Bob. We're all Bob, actually. Now, the difference is that we've been doing this our entire lives. And in this case, the town doctor, she represents modern medicine, which is basically doing its best to keep us alive without actually curing those things which ail us. And this is essentially a story reflecting this guiding rationale or first foundational pillar, which was, again, we were healthy, we made a bunch of changes, and we got sick. Now, I want you guys to see some of the data that supports this. So I'm going to hand it over to Nerdy Doug, or ATP, and he's actually going to take us through some of the figures and the data that underlies this. All right, so take it away there, ATP. Thanks, Doug. Good stuff. All right, I'll step through these three elements in a bit more detail now. So we were healthy, we made a bunch of changes, we got sick. And when I say we were healthy, I'm actually referring to our existence, our entire existence as a species on this planet. Most estimates have that around 150 to 200,000 years. And the interesting thing is, among anthropologists, it's actually really well known by studying the remaining hunter-gatherer societies that these populations, they're incredibly healthy, particularly with respect to the chronic modern diseases which are such a problem for us today. So I put together some data that actually looks at this. If we go to the next slide. Yeah, so here you go. So here's the data, and as you can clearly see from the data... Hold up. You're off to a bad start here, all right? We had talked about this. You can't use that type of chart. These videos are for normal people, all right? So keep that slide for the Big Bang Theory crowd. Doug, we can get rid of this slide. But let's then focus on what these studies were actually looking at, right? And what they were doing is they were comparing the health and fitness of traditional hunter-gatherer societies with us, with people from modern society. And we were actually looking at 4 health parameters. So maximal oxygen uptake, that's essentially measuring your ability to process oxygen when you're exercising. So it's a measure of aerobic fitness. Daily physical activity, that's just how much energy you burn each day adjusted for body weight. So it's physical fitness. Triceps skin fold thickness, that estimates the amount of body fat or percent body fat, and diabetes, which reflects metabolic health, right? And then for each of these, what the research did is they took a group of traditional hunter-gatherer societies, so in this case for maximal oxygen uptake or aerobic fitness, and then compared it to a sample of people from modern society, in this case a group of Canadians. And then if we look at the averages, as you can see, in general, the traditional hunter-gatherer societies, they have much better aerobic fitness than we do. In this case, about 50% more than the Canadian sample, right? And if you do that for all of the measures, well, it's not even really close. We just looked at maximal oxygen uptake, daily physical activity in general, 154% more calories burned each day. For the amount of body fat, these traditional groups in general have about half as much as we do. And in terms of diabetes, we suffer from diabetes 7 times more frequently than these traditional societies. If we translate that, and here are some of these traditional groups, they are effectively faster, fitter, and healthier than we are. ATP, hold up. For most of these hunter-gatherer societies, the average life expectancy, it's like 50 years or lower, right? So they're not even living long enough to develop these chronic diseases. And that would explain why the rates are so low, wouldn't it? I hear you, SD. And that question actually comes up a lot when we're discussing this topic. So, and I won't go into all the details now, but it's the following. Yes, the life expectancy of these groups is shorter than ours, and there's a number of reasons for that. But there's still a large, let's say, percentage of these groups that live into their 60s, 70s, and 80s, and they still don't develop our chronic modern diseases, right? So it's not the life expectancy. There's still plenty that arrive at 60 plus years, and they remain healthy and fit, right? And that actually takes me to a really important point, which is they're you, right? We're them. It's exactly the same body, or the same biotechnology, as I like to call it. The only difference is that their bodies are in an external environment and with external conditions that allow their bodies to thrive. And they really are faster, fitter, and healthier than we are. All right, so that takes us through the first element. Second element, we made a bunch of changes. Well, let's actually talk through what those changes were. Broken into 3 groups. So the first one is what we eat. Second is when and why we eat. And finally, how we live. And let's talk through each of those 3, starting with what we eat. Again, here broken down into 3 subgroups, right? The first one, so these are substances, they're not new. They've been around essentially throughout our entire existence on this planet. But the way we eat them today, it's either in a very modified format and or much, much more in terms of volume than we evolved to consume, all right? And there's 3 that are the most important. It's added sugars, grains, refined grains, and processed seed oils. Now, I refer to these as the deceitful 3 as a group. And they are, as a group, the single worst element of the modern diet. And we're going to talk much more about the deceitful 3 in upcoming videos, okay? You can also include alcohol here. The bacteria in our gut, they actually produce a small amount of alcohol. That's why we're able to process it. But certainly not in the volumes that we consume these days, right? Okay, so next group, new stuff. So these are the additives, the preservatives, the pesticides, the GMOs, etc. And what I always say is the following. If the substance wasn't around while we were evolving, then our bodies and our cells, by definition, they won't know how to process it, right? And so best case is just going to be neutral, and worst case, which unfortunately is the case with a lot of these substances, they're actually harmful, okay? So that's new stuff. And then finally, reduced or eliminated. Due to the processing, we actually rip out a lot of the vitamins and minerals and fiber, and that actually leads to deficiencies. Now, when we talk about fortified, so like fortified flour, fortified with iron and vitamins, etc., what that means is we're actually just putting some of the stuff back in that we ripped out and destroyed via the processing in the first place. So that's a very, let's say, optimistic use of the terminology, all right? So there you go. So those are the three things, and that's the first group, what we eat. Okay, group two, when and why we eat. Now, the first one here is this idea of eating on the clock. Now, breakfast, lunch, and dinner as a concept, that's actually a quite recent accommodation to the modern industrial workday. Most historians agree that as farmers, so right before the Industrial Revolution, it was likely 2 meals a day, one mid-morning after a few hours in the field, plus another one late afternoon when the day's work was done. Apparently the Romans had just 1 meal a day. But the point is that breakfast, lunch, and dinner, that's something that we basically came up with over the last 150 to 200 years. And the other thing is that just eating on the clock in general, as opposed to eating when we're hungry, that's certainly a departure from how we evolved on this planet. The second one is we eat more frequently, and that's our snacking culture. And you know what, here I think the companies, the food companies have a lot to do with this, because they really they push to generate these new consumption moments, whether it's like a mid-morning power-up or an afternoon get-me-through or whatever it is. But the reality is that we do end up eating quite frequently over the course of the day. And then finally, emotional and social eating. This one's really important, right? So there's a lot of people, I mean, for me it's alcohol actually, but for a lot of people, if you're happy, you eat. If you're anxious, you eat. If you're sad, you eat. And not necessarily tied to what your body actually needs in terms of nutrition. And then also, a lot of our social events, whether it's just grabbing a coffee or going somewhere to watch the game with a group of people, you end up eating as well. Now, three of these combined, essentially what you're saying is that if we're up, we're eating, right? And the other thing that this has caused is this disconnect between when we eat and the underlying requirements in terms of nutrition that our bodies actually require, right? So that's the second group. And finally, group three, the way we live, all right? The first one, we stop moving, all right? This is really important. Basically, as long as we've existed, we either moved or we died, literally. So our current sedentary lifestyle, which is made possible and due to the type of work we now do, technology, our gadgets, entertainment, etc., it's really completely new for our bodies and quite strange. So that's the first one, we stop moving. The second one is we sleep less and or poorly, again, driven by our chaotic lifestyle. And I would mention here as well this whole idea of going to sleep and waking up on the clock as opposed to sleeping and waking based on what our body actually requires. And then finally, and this one's really important, we suffer chronic stress. Now I always say, look, obviously hunters and gatherers, they had plenty of stuff to worry about, but it was typically acute stressors. So something like a moment of danger or a particularly bad storm or blizzard, but things that passed. And actually their lives were much more predictable, right? They lived in the same physical environment their entire lives with the same group of people, much more predictable. Whereas these days, we've got all kinds of stuff, right? We've got promotions to worry about, bills to pay, tests to study for, not to mention politicians that stress us out, social media. And these things, they keep us stressed out like day after day after day for really long periods. And again, our body simply doesn't know what's going on. It's never faced these types of prolonged periods of stress, right? So that's group three. Now, if we take a step back, all three groups on a single slide, and yeah, you'll see we actually have changed most, basically everything in the last 100 to 200 years. And so that takes us through, we made a bunch of changes. And the final group, we got sick. So unfortunately, this is undeniably true. Let's take a look at some of the data. So we start with the risk factors. So these are things that if you present them, it's more likely that you will develop disease going forward. Well, you can see the data, but 50% of the adult population with high blood pressure, 25 to 30% with an abnormal lipid profile, that's your cholesterol. Obesity, I actually consider obesity to be a disease, not a risk factor, but nearly 40% of the adult population is considered clinically obese. And in terms of childhood obesity, that's also been growing over the last 2 to 3 decades, which is obviously quite alarming. If we look at the diseases, chronic diseases themselves, here the percentages are lower because now you're actually suffering from the disease. But if you look at things like heart disease, stroke, diabetes is growing particularly fast, cancer, it's still really ATP. Sorry to jump in again, but are you trying to tell me that with all the advances in modern medicine, with all the advances in technology that we've had, that we're actually worse off today than we were 3-4 decades ago? I find that hard to believe. No, you're right, Esti. You're right. I mean, I fully agree. We're definitely not worse off. And in fact, modern medicine has done some amazing advancements, particularly in terms of life expectancy. I mean, we've gone from a life expectancy of about 50 to more than 80 in just a few decades. But what I would argue is that when you talk about these chronic diseases, what modern medicine is doing is managing the diseases without actually curing them, right? And so we live longer, but often live longer sick, right? Because we have to manage these conditions. So if we go back to the data, heart disease, this is data covering anywhere from 20 to 30 years. Heart disease is flat, stroke is actually growing, diabetes is growing quickly, cancer is growing. If you look at high blood pressure, right? So, okay, there's 50% have to manage it, and a lot of people probably have it under control because they're taking anti-hypertension pills. But if they were to stop taking those pills, that high blood pressure would return because, again, the conditions are being managed as opposed to being cured. And one last set of data. So this is data on the number of chronic conditions, medical visits, and medications, looking specifically at the segment of the population that is 65 years or older, right? So remember, 65, expect to live to 85, so I've got 20 years, and if I look at this to go, right, and if I look at this group, this data is a bit hard to understand. So number of chronic conditions, what this data means is that nearly, let's say about 15%, they have 4 or more chronic conditions that they're managing. More than 40, about 40 to 50 have at least 2 to 3 diseases that they're managing, right? So more than 60% have at least 2 chronic conditions that they are managing as opposed to resolving. And similar data, so if you look at, number of annual medical visits, these people are spending a lot of time in the hospitals in this phase of their lives. More than 20% visiting at least 10 times, often much more. And in terms of number of prescription meds, more than 50% are taking at least 3 prescription medications. That's, referring to the last 30 days. So, we're managing the diseases, but we're not curing them. And we're definitely sick, unfortunately. All right, so those are the 3 buckets that we've now stepped through. We were healthy, we made a bunch of changes, we got sick, and I'll hand it back over to Doug to wrap things up. All right, thanks ATP. Okay, so this was the first foundational pillar. We were healthy, we made a bunch of changes, we got sick, and in the upcoming videos, we're going to talk a lot about what we need to do to revive ourselves by undoing these changes. But just to make sure that every video has at least one piece of concrete advice, what I would tell you, if you can do one thing, it's eliminate the deceitful 3 from your diet. Now, it doesn't mean completely eliminate, but these 3 ingredients, they simply can't be the core of your diet. And if there's one thing to do to improve your health overall, particularly your metabolic health, it would be to keep the refined grains, the added sugar, and the processed seed oils as sort of a minimal component of your overall diet. All right? So, thanks. Cheers.